The clamour of voices calling for a negotiated settlement to the Ukraine war is rising. But this is happening just as the Ukrainian army has forced another tipping point towards eventual defeat for the invaders, with the retaking of Kherson, the only provincial capital to fall to the Russian forces in their campaign this year. But in the topsy-turvy world of Russian propaganda, the flight from Kherson is a strategic success to reinforce the east bank of the Dnipro as a springboard for future campaigns. But until Russia has been kicked out of Ukraine in its entirety, they will continue to spin defeat as a kind of victory. But is anyone buying this story? Or is Putin simply trying to buy himself more time to regroup, rearm, and inflict further destruction and misery on his innocent democratic neighbour? Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. If you enjoy the material we create and are interested in our fantastic guests like Robin, please like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos in YouTube. Robin Horsfall joined the British Army at the age of 15 in 1972. He served with a parachute regiment and 22 Special Air Service. He left the army in 1984 and worked as a mercenary, bodyguard, and as a medical officer in many active zones around the world. He then built London Karate for 20 years, teaching thousands the art and discipline of karate. When he broke his neck, he retired and went to Surrey University at the age of 56 and graduated in English literature and creative writing 3 years later. He is the author of several books, including the highly successful autobiography Fighting Scared. He's in great demand as an after-dinner speaker and campaigns against the persecution of war veterans and has plans for a veterans' human rights campaign. It says here in 2021. I kind of assume that's already kicked off. Also, I definitely advise you to check out his website. You'll find some incredible stuff there, including all of his published books and materials. Robin, welcome back to the channel.
Nice to be back. Thank you.
Well, it's quite a few months since we last spoke. And at that point, I think Kiev had failed to be taken by the Russians. But really, what has most surprised you over these last couple of months?
I don't think I've been surprised by very much, actually. Perhaps slightly by the incompetence of the Russian leadership, military leadership especially, in their inability to actually mount modern warfare. They're stuck back in the Second World War, resting on the laurels of what the Soviet army achieved in that period. And even then, their achievement was based on huge numbers, massive deaths, and overwhelming a superior soldier with superior numbers. They've fallen flat on their face. They're being defeated. And I don't think there are any surprises on my blogs on LinkedIn and Facebook. I think I anticipated almost everything that's happened.
And in some ways, we can compare the use of artillery and tactics to the Soviet army. In other ways, this is an inferior force, isn't it? Corruption seems to be even more endemic, incompetence, failure to learn the skills from either history or past conflicts. I mean, is that an impression you get, that this isn't even up to a Soviet standard?
Yeah, the oligarchs in Russia have robbed their country blind. They've stolen the military budget. They've promoted people who simply are prepared to pull their forelock and do exactly as they're told by those in authority. And everybody, once corruption starts, everybody becomes corrupt from the very top to the very bottom. So there's been no investment in the Russian military system, in their air defenses, in their air attack systems, in their officer training. It's all gone. And now they've come across an enemy that is sophisticated, is advanced, and is prepared to fight with their entire population. And they've really fallen flat on their face. They do not know where to go with it, and they're trying to make the best of a very bad job in the hope that they can actually negotiate some kind of place-saving device to escape from this campaign.
Now, we've had some very vivid impressions over the last few days, haven't we, of the fall of Kherson. And I don't want to call it a retreat because that I think is doing a disservice to the victory that Ukrainians have really fought for hard and won there. And of course, the Russians were billing this, that it was going to be a new Stalingrad, street by street fighting, incredibly intense, incredibly bloody. But of course, they've retreated with barely a whimper, and are now branding it as a kind of Dunkirk, a sort of strategic victory to reinforce, the other side of the Dnipro. It's really not a victory, is it?
No, it's a complete defeat in that particular area, and unfortunately, the national media in Europe, UK, USA tend to try to focus on the idea that or being even-handed and portray it as some kind of failure on the part of the Western powers and on behalf of Ukraine, whereas in fact they've been outmaneuvered. They've had military science used against them in a very, very effective way. They fixed the Russian forces in place, destroyed their resupply system and their logistics, and then let them burn themselves out until they had no choice but to retreat. And allowing them to get across the river, they only allowed the manpower to get across the river, not the materiel, not the heavy weapons, not the ammunition. So all they've got is a bunch of unarmed recruits and conscripts going back across the river with no equipment. So it's a huge success on for the Ukrainian armed forces. They've managed to force them out of there without mounting a major offensive and taking huge casualties. They've recovered all that ground. They've recovered the only city that Russia actually took in their invasion without huge losses. The Russians retreated in civilian clothes in many cases, hiding amongst the forced evacuation of civilian people to the south of the Dnipro River. There is no way any clear-thinking strategist can look at this as anything but a major retreat and defeat of the Russian army. And I think there will be future retreats and future defeats to come. Now they've crossed the river, everybody wants to talk about the fact that the Russians can sit on the other side of the river and fire their artillery. I don't understand how journalists are getting that idea, because the HIMARS system outranges the standard artillery that the Russians have. So they have to move back beyond range. They cannot threaten Kherson anymore. So again, there's this misinterpretation or misunderstanding of simple military strategy. They do not have the ability to sit on the other side of the river and wait. There's no need for Ukraine to cross that river at the moment. There is a need for them to occupy the Kherson Dam to the north, to enable them to control their power systems, their energy systems, and to prevent that being flooded. However, if it was flooded, it would flood the south side of the Dnipro, which would affect Russian forces, not necessarily Ukrainian forces. I anticipate the Russians taking as many of their forces as they can to the Donbass, but the Ukrainian forces in Kherson are now free to move up to that area as well. I think the forces that exist up in the north, in Luhansk, are in a position to actually outflank the strong positions that they have in Donetsk and come south. So if they fix them, they pin them to that position, and then they manage to penetrate to the north, they may well be able to take Luhansk and Donetsk and clear the whole area and recover their ground. Then what's Russia left with? It's left with Crimea. But if the Kerch Bridge is closed, then they have no way of resupplying their troops in Crimea. They're desperate to hold on to Sevastopol port, and maybe that would be something that could be negotiated as kind of base area that they can hold on to. But it's a massive defeat for Russia. Where it's going to go, nobody knows, but they're trying to hold on to this propaganda that's going to give them some kind of face-saving device. And I wish that Western media outlets would focus on the fact that peace at any cost is not peace at all.
You've actually anticipated three of my questions there, so I'll have to tick those off. But I was watching, it's not even correspondence. It's correspondence in the field. I've heard say exactly what you've just said there, which is somehow taking the Russian propaganda line and saying that this is a strategic reinforcement. I've even heard, and I won't name him, a military analyst saying the same. But it seems counterlogical to what we've seen. Now the entire gateway to Crimea and the south is within HIMARS range. And if they follow that strategy of taking out logistical routes, arm dumps, which have been extraordinarily successful, and I did speak to Sean McFate, I think it was, last week, and he was explaining how this is a tactic that probably came from NATO and from the training Ukrainians have been receiving from NATO, as that sort of crucial NATO Cold War strategy to try and counter the superiority in Russian, manpower and numbers, is to take out the logistics. But it means that if they're able to clean that area out or soften it up, they could potentially take Crimea before Donbass. And that in some ways would politically be far more dangerous for Putin. That might actually prompt an internal revolt against him.
I think the problem with Crimea at the moment is the amphibious problems of crossing the river. It's 1.5 kilometers, 2 kilometers wide in places. It's easily defended. And why take such a huge risk at this particular time? The biggest battle at the moment is taking place in Donetsk. And I think that's where the Russians are going to try and gain some credibility, using their Wagner mercenaries more than anybody else. But they want time. Putin wants time. He needs time to breathe. And it's vital that Zelensky doesn't give him time to breathe at all. If he's given time to breathe, if he's given time to negotiate, if he persuades people that they should actually have talks and discussions, then he's got time to train the mobilized conscripts that he's bringing to the front. He's got time to purchase weapons on the black market that nobody will give him. He's got time to persuade the Western world that his threats will actually be carried out. His threats of using weapons of mass destruction and so on will be carried out. Zelensky has stood up to the bully. The world is no longer frightened of the bully. They're saying, we're not scared of you anymore. We realize that you've been bluffing all along and you don't have the will or the ability to do this. And so we've got to follow through with that. But he's using propaganda and he's using the even-handedness of Western television and media outlets to promote himself and to promote his fear. And we must have a counter campaign saying, look, there's nothing to be frightened of anymore. Yes, if he's going to use these weapons, he'll use them anyway. Peace today is not necessarily peace tomorrow. Peace at any cost is not peace tomorrow. All we're doing is putting off. We must defeat him entirely. I don't mean me, because I'm not there, but the powers that are in charge must make sure that he's pushed out of all of Ukraine with his tail between his legs and politically defeated, militarily defeated, economically defeated, so that he will never think about doing it again.
And mentioning, I don't want to give too much spotlight to the nuclear terror threat, because the media seem to be especially susceptible to that one in particular, and go into hysterics about it. But he's laid out multiple red lines through the course of this conflict. And each of those red lines was potentially the trigger for World War III, attacking the Kerch Bridge, fall of Kherson, and many other points at which, that was going to be the trigger for something bigger. It seems that all of these red lines are illusory. It seems that they are all simply a sort of bully boy tactic. And the minute one of those red lines is crossed, they invent a new one. It was the same with Finland and Sweden joining NATO. That was going to trigger terrible consequences. Nothing whatsoever happened. The grain shipments, they caved in after 2 days when Turkey wouldn't give them any leeway.
There are actually huge doubts as to whether the Russian strategic and tactical nuclear defense systems would actually function and work. Tactical nuclear weapons are atomic. They are fission weapons. similar to Hiroshima. And although they're extremely powerful and dangerous, they require a great deal of maintenance. And the people that will operate them require a great deal of training. As far as strategic weapons are concerned, they need to be maintained, and the tritium that is vital for their effective operation needs to be replaced every 12 years. I actually, and maybe it's wishful thinking, but I actually feel that they have no confidence that their tactical weapons, all of their strategic weapons, would actually work if they ever decided to use them. But the USA has come out very, very strongly. General Petraeus, being the most outspoken in an interview on CNN, and said, should you even think about deploying these weapons and moving them from their storage areas, we will ensure that you're defeated with conventional means completely and totally. And they would not be enough to stop NATO and the USA from doing that. So I don't think they've really got the backup that they pretend they have.
And it's not like World War II. I don't think the Russian population, as was evidenced by the huge flight of fighting age males, I don't think they would stay and fight for their land in the same way that they fought during the Second World War. But it also has to be remembered, in the Second World War, they also had detachments of Cheka or FSB standing behind them, ready to shoot them in the back of the head if they retreated.
Yeah, that's right. And the people of Russia are better educated, better informed. They've traveled the world. They've seen other societies. They've seen democracy at work. They've emigrated. They've done business in Europe and the USA. So they're not the serfs, the poor people from the countryside who couldn't read and write, that were forced into the front line in the Second World War. It's a very, very different population today. And as you said, they've turned around and said, I'm not doing this. I'm going to hoof it down the road and get across the border before someone conscripts me. And those conscripts that have been forced into the front line are turning around and standing up to their officers and saying, we're not going to have this. We're not going to be treated like this. And those that can't do that are surrendering. So if you really start to look objectively at the whole picture, you've got a picture of Russian incompetence, poor political leadership, poor military leadership, and a system that simply cannot do what it pretended it could for so long. It's built its reputation on defeating very, very minor armies with huge superiority in Syria. But even then, they failed in Afghanistan.
And they did it by leveling cities. It's the same tactic as Grozny in Chechnya, Aleppo. It's the same strategy over and over. Destroy civilian infrastructure, destroy hospitals, destroy tower blocks, and basically just grind people back into the Stone Age. I mean, it's not sophisticated, is it?
Yeah, no, it's not. But what is fortunate is that the close affiliation between Ukrainians and Russians. The Ukrainians understand the Russian mentality entirely. They know how they lie. They know how they think. They know how they work. And I think that they are playing the chessboard so well, so cleverly. They're being well advised. They're being well provided for. And providing that we in the West continue to accept that we must pay higher taxes and pay higher fuel bills as a result of this, and we keep supplying Ukraine with what it needs, it's going to be their people fighting, not just for Ukraine's freedom, but for democracy the world over.
I think so. And the other interesting point, isn't it, about the sort of peacemongers and that sort of desperation. And I can understand from humanitarian reasons why, the media and others will clamour for a peace sooner rather than later. But at the same time, I mean, my retort to them is always, look at Russian diplomats, look at Russian politicians. They've utterly debased themselves as pathological liars. So what agreement is going to hold water with the current Russian government? Because as soon as it is strategically advantageous, they tear up anything that's written down on paper and go back to their old ways.
Yeah, I mean, you can put it into the simplest terms in the sense of a man in a bar who has a fight with somebody. They go outside, they take the jacket off, and they have a fight. And he puts the man on the floor, and then he puts his jacket on, goes to walk in. The guy picks up a rock and hits him over the back of the head, and he walks back in as the victor. And that's exactly the same way that Russia will work if anybody allows them to get back on their feet without being completely defeated. They will come back. They will use any method they can. They will use assassination against those that defeated them. They will use their money, if they still have it, to undermine democracy. It wasn't NATO that Putin saw as the threat to Russia. It was democracy that was encroaching on their doorstep. It was freedom. It was people being able to think for themselves and have freedom of speech and vote for their leaders without being intimidated. That's what Putin and his government and his oligarchs were actually genuinely frightened of.
Definitely. I mean, it threatens the one thing they care about, which is the loot that they've accumulated over many years. And of course, London has been a fantastic partner in helping them to launder all that loot.
That's right. That's the politics of expediency again, where people lose their integrity because it makes a profit. And we have lacked leadership with integrity for, I think, we have to go back a whole generation before we find somebody that actually says what they truly believe, rather than having spin doctors on their shoulders all the time, getting the masses of the population to believe absolute nonsense on the grounds that it's going to make a profit, that we're going to have a bus service, but provided it makes a profit, that we're going to have a health service, provided it makes a profit, rather than understanding that sometimes we have to dig deep in order to do what is right rather than what is profitable. And the Russians being allowed to invest all their stolen money in the city of London is just part of that sad picture.
I mean, a lot's going to happen to make sure we do go back to that. And later in the month, I'll be interviewing a couple of financial journalists to talk just about that corruption. So watch this space. But you also mentioned this, assassination of opponents and anyone who steps out of line. 3 of my speakers have now been sanctioned by the Russian government, and I keep watching the lists to see if your name comes up. I'm sure it will sooner rather than later. But this assassination works both ways, doesn't it? Because there are so many people in the oil and gas sector. There are so many administrators, even so many people in the military now, and administrators like Stremosov, who is the governor of Kherson. They have a tendency to meet with really rather nasty and improbable accidents, don't they?
Yeah, well, all tyrants can't resign, and Putin is a tyrant. He's a dictator, and so the only way he can leave is by being pensioned into a sanatorium somewhere or being murdered. And but he can't resign, and so consequently, anybody that's a threat to him is going to be removed. And he's been conveniently removing lots of people who fall out of windows and have car accidents and so on for the last 7 months, and that's going to continue until somebody with enough power and money undermines him and defeats him. But he's probably the most protected person in the world at this time. Going back to your previous point about I tend to write online rather than speak online. It gives me more chance to think clearly. And my blogs on LinkedIn and Facebook are carefully considered. But I get attacked daily by trolls, by those who work for foreign governments, and I have to disinfect and remove them and be extremely careful with my choice of language and even photographs. That's a constant battle. So they're there. I'm on their radar, but I'm managing to work my way through the system quite carefully and methodically. But I get about, I don't know, about 1.5 million views on LinkedIn alone on my writing rather than on YouTube posts.
And you get a lot of spammy comments on there, which I've seen. And I think one of your interesting ones recently, I mean, where you were discussing the industrialization of this sort of digital disinformation. Now, when this war ends in Ukraine's victory, that online battle will almost certainly accelerate, won't it? I mean, that's not going to go away.
Yeah, well, I think I was the first person to use the term industrialized. I can't remember what term I used, but I called it industrialization of YouTube essentially, and of the media, and by the use of money and troll farms. So they're actively attacking anybody. They've got the red flag comes up, a username like Putin or Trump or Boris or anything like that, and immediately they're paid to attack and cancel you out. And they do it in a very constructive way. They get multiple numbers of people to mount complaints against you, which gets you taken down until you appeal. And providing you can justify your post, then you can get back up. But it closes you down, it wears you down. And it's proved very, very successful. It's one of the great weaknesses of the internet, is that lies and disinformation travel far faster than good news. Reasonable behavior is no longer dominant. It's actually unreasonable lies, misinformation that is controlling how people think. And it takes an awful lot of effort for those of us who try to behave reasonably and think carefully about what we do and don't say, and not get sucked into the gutter. For us to be out there all the time and get that kind of platform. Unfortunately, national media outlets don't support that. They love the idea that there's going to be conflict. They love bad news. They love spreading misinformation because it sells product. It gets clicks. If you mention nuclear, wow, they're away. Nuclear, oh my God, we're all scared. Working on people's fears. When you reassure people and try to say, well, look, we don't think that's not good news. That doesn't sell product. And that's something I try to talk about fairly frequently.
And that's what's really surprised me. I mean, when I started doing these videos, and of course they're typically between sort of 50 minutes and an hour long, and I didn't think anyone would actually watch them. But the average view time is around 20 minutes. That means that a certain number of people are actually watching the entire thing, and I think there is a craving there for people who are thoughtful, for much more in-depth conversations.
Yeah, there's a group that I've called the moral moderate majority, and that's the vast number of people out there. But those people are working hard, getting on with their lives, worrying about getting the money to send the kids to school and how they're going to pay the electricity bill at the end of the month. And they're not deeply involved in politics. They're just picking it up in the back of their minds, from the radio when they're driving the car to work, from the news in the evening. And so they're not really, really getting involved and engaged until it threatens them, until all of a sudden it becomes a concern and a worry. And even then, they don't know enough about it, because they're not being very well informed about the causes and the effects. They're just picking up the propaganda that's sitting on the outside all the time. Worry about nuclear war, worry about the Third World War, worry about the high electricity prices. Why should we have to be paying for this war? And so on. And nobody's really giving a great deal of support to the counter argument, to the reasonable argument, to the explanations. And that's where we come to play, I think.
And of course, it does mean that democracy is vulnerable, actually, because it can constantly be attacked, because governments do have to, I won't say pander to, but they have to reflect the population's requirement. But I think it's very interesting what you just there about, unless things directly affecting people. This can also be made relevant to the issue of conscription, can't it? We only really saw... and again, I don't want to position it in the wrong way. It wasn't opposition to the war. It was opposition to being conscripted to the war. We only really saw any kind of voices raised in Russia, or any kind of defiance, when it came to people actually being press ganged. And I use that word literally, because people are being dragged off the streets, dragged out of their workplaces and apartments, straight down to the training center, and then sometimes within 4 days of being press ganged off the street and say, not so much St. Petersburg, but provincial towns, they were actually at the front. I think the turnaround was somewhere between, from civilian life to body bag is around 5 days, I think, the current, which is deeply shocking. But again, it says something about individuals really not wanting to engage with the politics until they're directly threatened.
Yeah, it's a wonderful thing about resistance movements, that they're usually empowered by the young. It's the young people that are going to be conscripted first, the young adults, the students, the young business people, and they're the ones with the least amount of responsibility in their lives. Most of them haven't purchased houses. They don't have children. And so they're the ones with the least to lose. So they're the ones most likely to be brave and go out on the street and resist authority. And we have a history in Europe of student rights, of students being the ones to go out and march and present their story. You've got to give them credit for having the courage to do that, and good for them. But yes, only when it knocks on their front door and it starts to affect them, because this war and all wars that Russia's been involved in the last generation haven't affected the people of St. Petersburg and Moscow. They've only affected the soldiers, and the casualty figures have been relatively low when you compare them to what's happened. I mean, the Russian army, if you believe the most moderate and carefully considered statistics, have actually had killed more than the whole of the British armed forces. They've lost dead more than the whole of the British armed forces in the last 8 months. That's how many people they've lost. That's how tragic this is for the Russian people. It's a terrible price to pay for Vladimir Putin's ego and ambitions.
And the amount of equipment is mind-boggling, isn't it? Reputedly, around half of the main battle tanks have been destroyed, and that includes some of the more modern types as well. And with the restrictions on import of advanced components, and of course restrictions on certain exports, although they're finding other markets for those. What does that do to Russia's capability to wage war in the coming decades even?
Well, their ability to wage war has already been proven to be inadequate. They can't currently engage in war. Now the sanctions are in place. They can't get the high technology to upgrade, even if they wanted to. The other thing, of course, is that their economy is starting to fail, and it's going to continue to fail because they can't replace the European markets that have been cut off and are going to continue to be cut off. And the Americans are putting great pressure on India and China with threatening secondary sanctions in February. So they're not going to be able to resort to those markets either in the next few months. So Russia has put itself back 50 years. Militarily, they were inadequate anyway. Now they've depleted their ability to fight because they've lost so much materiel, so much of their stockpiles, and they don't know how to upgrade it because they can't upgrade it without Western expertise. It's not there for them anymore.
And one question I definitely sort of need to ask while I've got you here is the winter war. I mean, again, the media wisdom is that the Ukrainian winter will prevent any advances, etc., etc. But of course, we're seeing in Kherson an extraordinary advance, despite the winter already beginning there. And again, the lesson of the Finnish-Russian war of the late 1930s seems not to have been learnt as well. And the Finns did extremely well against the Russians precisely in the winter conditions. And it would seem that the ill-equipped Russian forces may well be at a distinct disadvantage as the temperature plummets. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think the Finnish war was very different in the sense that they were in defensive positions and the Russians were the ones who had to take the offensive. And the advantage, especially in winter warfare, is with the defenders. And the Russians are digging defensive positions. Where their weakness truly lies is in their logistics. They have to supply the arms, the ammunition, the food, the shelter, the heating, and the training for the troops that are going to sit in those defensive positions between December and April. And that's going to be very, very uncomfortable. If a soldier isn't trained and managed properly, he'll end up dying of cold injuries. He'll get trench foot, he'll get frostbite, he'll get hypothermia. And if he's not well fed, he'll die anyway. So there are already stories coming out about them being unable to understand how to look after their feet in cold, wet conditions. When they get freezing wet conditions, that's going to be exaggerated even more. The Ukrainian army is being well trained. It's being well supplied. It has good clothing. It has a good, strong supply of food to the front lines. The men will be able to be recirculated back into warm rest areas and then go back into the front line. When the ground hardens, they won't need to use the roads as an axis for their attacks. So they will be able to expand their front line and maybe outflank the Russian defenses. In the meantime, the extra range that the HIMARS produce and the 155 ammunition produces is going to put those defenders under extraordinarily pressure that they won't be able to respond to. So the advantage is not necessarily wholly with the defenders as it was with the Finnish campaign. It's very much far more evenly balanced, and with great generalship and great military science. I think that there's a definite threat for Russia to lose Donbass completely, and then we'll see where that goes and push everything back to the border, and then all they're left with is then they can swing down to Mariupol and recover that area there, and then later threaten Crimea. That's just my layman's guess, but I think that's the most likely approach in the coming months. But there's huge advantages to having the best men, the best equipment, the best training, and the best food.
And I was going to pick up on that because, again, when I was speaking to some sort of military academics in the last couple of weeks, and one of the interesting points one of them was making is just the sheer discipline. He said, when you look at the Ukrainian soldiers, their uniforms typically are neat. They're tidy. They obviously pay attention to the details on the uniforms, and the uniforms, the quality of them is substantially better. But he also said that there's an interesting difference in tactics. You look at the Russians. Now, obviously, this is on sort of memes and videos and whatever, so it's not a scientific process, but you see a certain amount of chaos, whether it's in advance or retreat. And he was pointing out a column of Ukrainian tanks, and they were keeping an exact set of seconds apart to make themselves less vulnerable for artillery. So he was saying it's not only about sort of discipline in terms of their equipment and the structure of, they're actually implementing quite a tactical way of behavior, and that comes from the sort of training and the sort of local hierarchy that they've got. And pointed out that you don't see the same in the Russian troops. Is that something you've sort of spotted on the on all the sort of myriad of footage we get to see on LinkedIn and others?
It's very apparent that they are more highly trained, better disciplined, better behaved. But the biggest factor of all in that regard is it's very easy to keep soldiers disciplined when they're well led and when their morale is high. And there's no higher morale than when you're defeating the enemy and you believe in what you're doing at the same time. They believe that they're defending their homeland, their people, their families. They know that they're winning. And so they're prepared to make the sacrifices that the Russian conscripts aren't prepared to make. And that's reflected in their pride in their uniforms, their pride in their skills, their pride in their behavior, and everything else, even their pride in their willingness to take prisoners and to treat them well. All that comes across so well in comparison to the other side.
Oh, I know. It's heading for tea time, I think, for both of us. And I had one sort of last question, which actually might be a long one or a short one. It depends on how we tackle it. But it does seem that the West is preparing for a Ukrainian victory. It's not clear what that might look like. I think we believe that that needs to be total and encompass the entirety of their legal territory, or Russia will carry on causing trouble. So we are preparing for that. And there's a proto-Marshall Plan in place for reconstruction. And also a lot of Russian central bank funds have been, of course, frozen and are potentially going to be handed over to Ukraine. That's incredibly positive. So we're preparing for a Ukrainian victory, but are we preparing for a Russian defeat? It seems to me, at least, that the West doesn't have any kind of plan for how to deal with a vindictive, defeated, and potentially chaotic Russia.
Yeah, that's. I think that's an extremely important question. The military defeat of Russia and the recovery of Ukraine, all Ukraine, is a vital part of the plan. But I don't think it'll benefit anybody in the world for Russia as a nation to disintegrate, and that would be a huge problem. We would like, I think those people in governments thinking very carefully about the future will know that they want Russia to continue to exist as a nation, as a trading partner, as somebody to do business with, but they don't want them to be a military power anymore and a threat to Western democracy.
Absolutely. And of course, it's very difficult to predict. I know we would love to believe that there'd be some kind of liberal path to power there. And of course, many of the liberals who are now abroad, they have their own stations, they're very articulate, etc. I'm not sure even they understand the scale of the problem, given that essentially Russia is a society run and totally controlled by the security services. And winkling them out, that's not really a military problem. That is a whole other problem.
No, it's a police state, and we can sit in judgment, but people who have a gun held to their head are going to do as they're told, and it takes a huge amount of courage for people to stand up to tyranny and authority, and sacrifices have to be made for that. And hopefully, the sacrifices that have been made in Ukraine will be enough to allow a more liberal society to exist in Russia in the coming future. Let's hope so.
Well, that's a good place, I think, to end on. Relative optimism. Robin, it's a huge, huge pleasure to speak with you again. And I absolutely advise people to check out your books and your website. We're going to put a link to it in the description of this video. So please check that out. And yeah, all I can say is Slava Ukraini, and I'm extremely grateful for you to speak.
Yeah, Slava Ukraine.
Thank you.